Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would talk about this video and this subject that I found to be very particularly interesting. And this is going to be a subject and a video that I'm going to actually review by that of the IBFP, which is a channel that overall that I think has a decent amount of good videos. Now, it doesn't mean that I agree with everything, on the IBFP necessarily, but I definitely find his channel a decent amount more watchable, and logical than that of the LDBC new media channels. Once again, doesn't necessarily mean that here and there that maybe I don't think that the IBFP, in my view, that I don't disagree with some of the stuff that he says, but I certainly find him a lot better overall than any of the LDBC new media channels, just in my personal view. But, for those of you that have kind of heard about overall, the most recent rumblings within that of boxing, we kind of have our, decent fights upcoming, but, we're still kind of figuring about what fights are going to be upcoming. Of course, we know that Keith Thurman versus Tim Tszyu is going to happen, I believe, on March 30th. Devin Haney versus Ryan Garcia, I believe, on April 20th. Bivol versus Better Beeve, I think it's been set up for later on this year. I think maybe in like May or June or July, sometime around there. And of course, there's been a lot of rumblings about the PBC and, when are their big fights going to be turned on? What fights are they going to put on, especially with their new deal of Amazon Prime, with their new subscription. And of course, the big question has mainly been about Gervonta Tank Davis and his headliner and overall who he's potentially going to be fighting next and who's going to be on that undercard. And the recent rumblings, of course, have been Frank Martin, but nothing has really been confirmed. And you never really know with Gervonta Tank Davis, so we'll see. But when it comes down to it, apparently the undercard, at least one of the undercards on this card, could potentially be that of Demetrius Andrade versus that of David Morrell, which is a very particularly interesting fight. But like I stated, Demetrius Andrade, when he fought that of David Benavidez last year, I said that this was going to be clearly the most important fight of both of their careers. But just like that of the Joseph Parker and Deontay Wilder fight, I said with the amount of pressure overall that there was going to be on Demetrius Andrade, or overall with the context behind it, at least with a lot of, people, the way that they looked at Demetrius Andrade, especially with the fan base of Canelo Alvarez. If Andrade did not beat that of David Benavidez, and if he ended up getting stopped against David Benavidez, his career was basically over from then. Because if you take a look at that, I mean, when it comes down to it, first of all, you're going to have a lot of narratives about Demetrius Andrade, which is that he was a complete hype job and a complete fraud from the start. And listen, what I'll state is this. A lot of boxing channels out there, especially the ones that I like to review about the LDBC and new media, they love to allege that about Fury and Lomachenko and Canelo and some of the other guys. But then when it comes to their fighters like Deontay Wilder losing to Joseph Parker or Tyson Fury, or when it comes to Andrade, really not, I'm not going to say giving a piss poor performance, but really, really having a disappointing performance, at least in certain people's eyes, they're never frauds. You always notice that. But then whenever it comes to the fighters that they need to tear down, then all of a sudden those guys are frauds. And don't get me wrong, they're not the only types of media that does this. Old media and ESPN, they kind of do this as well. They kind of had a similar energy with Guillermo Rigondeaux, I think, after Lomachenko, even though he did quit, in my view, in embarrassing fashion in that fight. And there's some other people. I'm not one to really call fighters frauds, but what I did overall state about Demetrius Andrade, in my view, is that if he did not show up, at least in good fashion, in that fight against David Benavidez, he was going to be looked at as debatably the biggest hype job of the past 10 plus years. And the thing is about Demetrius Andrade, and, I don't think that that's a completely fair assertion, but I did always say, just in my personal view, that Andrade was a little bit overrated in my view. People always talked about how he was the most talented guy at 154 and then 160 and then 168. I never personally saw that. It isn't that I don't see the talent that's there, but he's always been a fighter in my view that, I don't know, I've just never taken a look at one of his fights and said, wow, that's the best guy at that particular weight class. Maybe when he was at 160, when Canelo kind of left and Gennady Golovkin wasn't as interested there anymore, maybe then he may have been the best fighter. But I don't know if Demetrius Andrade really was ever confirmed as the best all-around fighter of any weight class. I don't know how you could really allege that he ever was. Maybe at 160 for a short time when nobody was there. And I'm not stating that, that's all Demetrius Andrade's fault. I do think that certain fighters did avoid that of Demetrius Andrade, including that of Charlo and, even Canelo, I think overall that he did somewhat avoid that fight because I think that he took a look at Demetrius Andrade as just a little bit too much trouble for what he's actually worth. Someone that would be a little bit too dangerous for the amount of risk and reward that he was going to bring to the table. It just is what it is. But Demetrius Andrade, once again, against David Benavidez, he pretty much proved what I always thought about him, which is that although he's greatly talented in some areas, in terms of a talent, the way that people were trying to push him, he was massively overrated. It just is what it is. And I'm not stating once again that he's not a great talent, and he's probably a Hall of Famer, but when people were trying to compare him to, say, basically the 154-pound version of Floyd Mayweather Jr., and people were stating in the David Benavidez fight that, oh, you're going to see the real Demetrius Andrade, that overall, he's 10 times better than Caleb Plant. I never seen a fighter like that. And Caleb Plant in the David Benavidez fight, Caleb Plant gave David Benavidez a very rough time. He won at least 4 to 5 rounds in that fight, at least in my view. At the very least 4. Demetrius Andrade, I think he won the first couple of rounds, maybe the third if you wanted to be a little bit generous. And then after 2.5 rounds, he pretty much completely petered out. He went out in very sorry fashion. And that's probably what Demetrius Andrade is going to be remembered as, at least from a certain amount of people. From some people, of course, that remember him, they're going to be, he's going to be remembered as a guy that was a great talent and unfortunately just ended up getting the opportunity a little bit too little, too late, throughout his career. While some other people, they're going to look at him as a complete hype job and someone that was completely overrated. I think that, the truth is a little bit in the middle. I think that as a talent that he was always overrated. I don't think that he was ever a complete hype job. But do I ever think that he was on the level of what a lot of people tried to say that he was? No. Not in my personal view. And that's why he could not even last any more than 6 rounds against that of David Benavidez. Well, now we kind of bring up to this point to where, what does Demetrius Bubo Andrade really do at this point in time in his career? Does he go after David Morrell? Does he go after someone else in the 168-pound weight class? Does he go back down to 160 pounds and try to have a unification fight and try to fight Janabek or someone like that? Are any of those options really great for Demetrius Andrade? Because if you're Demetrius Andrade, and I give him credit, I think that he tried to fight David Benavidez in order to try and get that Canelo Alvarez fight. I think that they both did. But, when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, it's like, who are you going to fight now? Because if you end up losing another fight in your career overall, because more than likely that Canelo Alvarez fight is not happening, when it comes down to it. So if you fight David Morrell, someone that is not a champion, someone that, has a little bit of a fan base, but someone that, has 9 to 10 fights on his resume, someone that's heavily talented and also very dangerous, potentially even more dangerous than that of David Benavidez, someone overall that's could very easily knock you out, especially in your older age when it comes down to it. And if Demetrius Andrade goes out in sorry fashion, his career is basically over. Like, that's why I always stated that it was very much more important, in my view, that Demetrius Andrade win that fight versus that of David Benavidez. Because even had David Benavidez lost that fight, yeah, it would have been traumatic for his career, but he still could have possibly continued his career. He was a young guy, and on top of that, he kind of has that Mexican-American fan base. He has somewhat of an entertaining style, so he could have moved forward. But if Demetrius Andrade lost that fight, especially in bad fashion, his career was over. There's no fights out for him right now, other than that of Janabek and that of David Morrell. And can he really win both of those fights? Can he really win either of those fights? I'm not quite so sure about that. And if you want to fight Janabek, why really would you want to take that fight? A Kazakhstan European fighter that's tough as nails and all in all seems to have a decently high boxing IQ, someone that's a decent athlete, and someone overall that could also easily potentially beat you, or is a 50-50 level fight, even at your best, or to fight David Morrell at 168 to potentially get that Canelo Alvarez fight. Because would you really want to fight Janabek at 160, even though you claim that that's your natural weight class, and you just end up possibly either losing or beating the, Janabek, and basically that's all you're remembered for, and if you end up losing the Janabek, it's going to be looked at as even worse because, he's not looked at as one of the elite black American fighters, at least in a lot of people's eyes. Now, of course, David Morrell is not an American fighter either, but he's looked at as one of the slick black Cuban fighters, one of the biggest threats in the 168-pound weight class. So, I don't know. We'll see overall what ends up happening. But Demetrius Andrade is really in between a rock and a hard place. He's basically on a suicide mission. There's basically no great avenue for Demetrius Bubo Andrade right now. There's almost none. But anyways, the IBFP is going to talk about it. Let's tune in.
He's come out and stated that Demetrius Andrade in his last fight was stopped. Demetrius Andrade versus David Morrell. Look, let's break it down honestly and objectively as possible. And according to Rick Glacier, he's come out and stated that Demetrius Andrade in his last fight was stopped by Benavidez. Now the PBC is putting Demetrius Andrade in with David Morrell on the Tank Davis pay-per-view undercard show. The PBC is passing Andrade around like a used condom. Now the PBC and Amazon expects you to...
Well, if you're Demetrius Andrade at the current moment in time, I don't really know how old he is. Maybe he's about 34 to 35 years old. Some may say that he even showed a little bit of age in his most previous fights. And that's going to be the question also for a lot of people. Did Demetrius Andrade kind of just get aged out, or was he a guy that really was just as never as good as what people say? Once again, I think it was a little bit of both. The fact that this was the biggest fight in your career, and I understand that, you're about, 34, 35 years old, and certain people might take a look and, because I've stated in the past that Canelo, in my view, also looks like an aged fighter, and they might say, well, you say that Canelo looks like an aged fighter, how come you won't say that Andrade is? Because Canelo's only 33 years old. And Canelo is only 33 years old, but people must remember that he's been fighting for 18 professional years, and he's been in legitimate fights. Like, people can say whatever they want to, but Austin Trout was a big fight. Cotto was a big fight. Kovalev was a big fight. Danny Jacobs, Gennady Golovkin, Araceli Lara, Dimitri Bivol, Floyd Mayweather Jr., Billy Joe Saunders, Callum Smith, Caleb Plant. All those fights were big fights. You can say whatever you want to about Canelo. How many big fights has Demetrius Andrade really ever been in his career other than David Benavidez? The answer is none. Like, not even close. It just is what it is. So Andrade, yeah, he might be, 34 to 36 years old. But at the end of the day, the amount of aging that is on Andrade, even though he might be a little bit older, is probably even less overall than what Canelo Alvarez is, because Canelo has actually been in wars before. He's actually been in real fights. And once again, I don't blame all that on Demetrius Andrade. I think that to a certain degree that he got a little bit screwed, but at the end of the day, when it comes down to it, it just is what it is.
Pay for it. Now, this is a joke to Rick Glacier, but what's interesting about this is they're literally passing Demetrius Andrade around like they passed around Southpaw's mom.
And some people, once again, might say, I wish Demetrius Andrade wouldn't do this because I would rather see him fight at the middleweight division and maybe become unified there. But if you're Demetrius Andrade, you realize that the only way that people are going to take a look at you and see that you're actually all-time great, and to be quite honest with you, I don't know if Andrade is ever going to possibly get that acclaim, because after the way that he went out against David Benavidez, when it comes down to it, Andrade realizes that he's going to have to get in the position to fight either David Benavidez in a rematch or fight that of Canelo Alvarez. He's going to have to fight one of the two. It is what it is. And the way overall to get there, of course, is to potentially defeat that of David Morrell. Why would you really want to go back to the middleweight division, fight a dude from Kazakhstan that not really a whole lot of people know? Of course, for those of us that are boxing aficionados, and for those of us that have been around for a while, we know who Janibek is. And he's a very great boxer, or a very decently great boxer. But at the end of the day, it's like, why would you want to fight that guy? What credit are you really going to get for majorly beating that guy when it comes down to it? Demetrius Andrade realizes that if his name is to be remembered, he's going to have to beat either Canelo or he's going to have to beat either David Benavidez. So he knows that this is his ticket. Demetrius Andrade basically takes a look at it and says, this is my last opportunity. And if I don't end up winning this fight, or if I have to really, truly go back down to the middleweight division, I might as well retire anyway. At least overall, that's the way that I look at it. Or maybe he might get his ass kicked against David Morrell potentially, and then he might choose to go back down to the middleweight division to potentially at least be remembered as a great middleweight champion. I don't know. We'll see.
I mean, let me break this down even more for you. Think about it. Demetrius Andrade, this guy has finally stepped up and fought David Benavidez, the first top fighter he's ever fought in his career, and he was destroyed to the point where he quit against David Benavidez. Now, according to Rick Glacier, he could be fighting David Morrell in the Tank David.
When I was doing my live, I remember there was a certain amount of people commenting there, and I actually had a few of my watchers, they predicted that Demetrius Andrade, that he was going to get stopped within that of 5 to 6 rounds. And I was like, no, I don't see that. I think Andrade is going to last a little bit longer. And sure enough, I ended up being wrong. Demetrius Andrade overall, he ended up stopping the fight overall and saying that I'm done after 6 rounds. Like I said, Demetrius Andrade, had he lasted in the latter rounds or lasted throughout that whole entire fight, his career at least would probably be looked at as a little bit more in a positive light, because David Benavidez, even as a 168 pounder, it's clear he's not really a natural 168 pounder. The dude is a light heavyweight or a cruiserweight, basically being a weight bully. Don't get me wrong, that's not me stating overall that certain fighters still are not able to fight him there or shouldn't fight him there, because at the end of the day, if you make the weight and if he's a mandatory and if he's there, then you're going to have to fight the guy. It just is what it is. That includes Canelo Alvarez. But, at the end of the day, once again, had Demetrius Andrade lasted at least, 10 to 11 rounds, his career would be looked at as a lot better. But the fact that this was the biggest fight in your career and you couldn't even go past 6 rounds is going to look really, really bad, especially if Demetrius Andrade ends up not winning any big fights in his career, because he's never won any big fights in his career. It is what it is.
This pay-per-view undercard, if this is true and this happens, then Demetrius Andrade is going to get slaughtered. I mean,
That's a very big possibility. I would like to see Demetrius Andrade at least put up somewhat of a fight, but just taking a look at it, do I believe that that's going to happen? Probably not. David Morrell, in my view, still needs to be a little bit seasoned as a fighter, but he's very dangerous. He's also another guy that could be looked at as a potential light heavyweight fighter. He's very powerful. He appears to be growing his skill set as the fights go along. He's a slick Cuban dude when it comes down to it. I just don't see Andrade, really doing that well in that fight. And on top of that, once again, certain people might say, well, why don't you have a little bit more sympathy for that of Demetrius Andrade in the David Benavidez fight? Because he was moving up in weight. He had never fought really consistently at 168, blah, blah, blah. Well, at the end of the day, when it comes to someone like, say, for example, like Canelo was at least 5'7" with like a 71-inch arm reach. Demetrius Andrade is a legit 6'2" when it comes down to it, or somewhere around there. He's about the same height as David Benavidez with the same amount of reach, and he rehydrated at 195. I keep telling people that a lot of these guys that take a look at Canelo, like when they take a look at those guys like Danny Jacobs and Gennady Golovkin and Jamal Charlo and Demetrius Andrade, they're all bigger than what Canelo Alvarez is. The reason why they don't rehydrate heavier than what Canelo Alvarez does is because overall they've never had to when it comes down to it. Now, Canelo just rehydrates a lot because he's a big boy anyway, but, at least in terms of, girth-wise or built-wise. But, in terms of bigness-wise, I've been telling people this for years. I said that I'm telling you that Jamal Charlo in the Canelo Alvarez fight is going to be similar in weight to what Canelo Alvarez was, and he was. And I said that don't be surprised if Demetrius Andrade comes into that fight at about 180-something, 190-something, and he came in at about damn near 200 pounds. So once again, Demetrius Andrade, when it comes down to it, once again, he's a dude that could easily fit at the 168-pound weight class. He's the same size as Caleb Plant and Jamal Charlo. He's the same size as those guys.
Morrell is better than David Benavidez in most categories: speed, power, skills, defense. This guy is going to destroy Demetrius Andrade. I mean, we just got to be honest and unbiased. There's a reason why David Benavidez...
And I will say that styles do make fights, so maybe if David Morrell tries to box him a little bit too much, maybe Andrade can possibly outslick him. But I've already stated this. In my view, Demetrius Andrade, the way that people talk about him, you would swear that this dude was like Pernell Supi Whitaker. He has that slick black American style. He does, but he's not as smart as those guys in my view. He's a guy that can be a little bit too defensively irresponsible. Sometimes he throws a little bit too sloppy and wild in my view, and you've seen that within some of his fights. That's why I've stated, Demetrius Andrade, very decent talent, but in terms of, the way that people were ranking him, in my view, he was always overrated.
Benavidez is not interested in fighting David Morrell. At the end of the day, Demetrius Andrade is going to get destroyed. He's simply not, the type of guy that's going to be able to put up a fight against a power puncher. He doesn't have a top chin.
That was also another thing about Demetrius Andrade. Like, I remember when people were talking about Canelo Alvarez avoiding Demetrius Andrade, and they were saying, oh, he needs to fight a guy. He's fighting Caleb Plant and Billy Joe Saunders. He needs to fight a guy with power like Demetrius Andrade. Like, dude, Demetrius Andrade is not a huge puncher. I mean, yeah, he's probably more powerful than debatably Caleb Plant and probably definitely more than Billy Joe Saunders. But when you talk about his power, it's like Andrade is not really like, this super great puncher. He never has been.
He doesn't have the defense or skill set to survive.
Now, once again, does that mean that he would have not gave Canelo Alvarez hell or trouble in that fight? Absolutely not. Does that mean that Canelo should have not fought him? No. I'm not stating that, but once again, I just never got these narratives of, Andrade, like, oh, he's got real power. Like, where has this, destructive power ever been? I've just never seen it.
12 rounds with a top fighter. I mean, at the end of the day, it looks like the PBC is just using Demetrius Andrade for whatever value he has left.
And once again, I remember the talks going into this fight against David Benavidez. I had people saying, oh, you guys are going to see, he's 10 times better than Caleb Plant. And I said, okay, well, you know what? That remains to be seen. Let's see. Because I have no problem admitting when I'm wrong. And not only does it appear that he's not 10 times better than Caleb Plant, he may not even be better than Caleb Plant at all. I've always stated in my view that Andrade and Caleb Plant, they're about on the same level. I think that in certain things that Andrade might be smarter than Caleb Plant. So maybe if you want to say that at his best, he's about, maybe 2 times or 1.5 times better than Caleb Plant, maybe. But to be honest with you, that's really even a heavy debate. Because at least Caleb Plant overall, was able to last 12 rounds against David Benavidez. And certain people might say overall, oh, well, that was kind of the referee. And you might have a little bit of a point there. But, when it comes down to, he was able to give David Benavidez a really tough fight. Andrade, after the first 2.5 rounds, he was done.
Which is very little to none. Demetrius Andrade should be happy that he should be able to get a payday out of all of this. But David Morrell is going to destroy Demetrius Andrade if all of this is true, according to Rick Glazier. And at the end of the day, Demetrius Andrade, this is his fault. You can't waste your entire career and never fought one world champion.
Well, it's not completely Demetrius Andrade's fault why certain fights didn't happen. Canelo didn't show interest, really. Billy Joe Saunders backed out of the fight. Jamal Charlo really wasn't highly interested, and even Gennady Golovkin thought that there was better avenues. I don't completely blame Andrade, but there's also times where you have to blame Andrade, where there's certain fights overall that he probably could have took. He backed out of the Charlo fight. Of course, that was because, he believed that he was kind of being, blackballed when it comes down to it, or, whatever the right word is for that, being paid low. I understand, but that fight would have done wonders for your career. And then, of course, he was able to, he turned down the PBC deal at one point in time when he probably should have signed with them. So Demetrius Andrade, he certainly doesn't deserve all the blame in his career, but he deserves a little bit.
Never beat a world champion after 15 years of fighting. You look really stupid. Demetrius Andrade will get destroyed yet again.
But anyways, that's pretty much about it overall for today. I just thought that I would talk about that. But very interesting. Do I agree with the IBFP that more than likely that David Morrell is going to beat up Demetrius Andrade? More than likely. We'll see what happens. Andrade, in my view, once again, I never really was super duper impressed with him in the first place, at least not to the level that many people were saying that he was. When it comes down to it. And he does look a little bit older. And I'm sure overall that David Benavidez knockout, that didn't do any wonders for his career. So we'll see. If he's able to come back and actually beat David Morrell, then great. But if not, then it's pretty much going to be just what I predicted. But we'll see what ends up happening. Hopefully, potentially this fight actually gets set up. I would love to see Andrade versus that Janibek, but I just don't think that fight's going to happen. If you're Andrade, why would you really want to fight that Janibek? Super dangerous fighter. And a guy that if you end up losing to him, your career is definitely over them because, what? You're going to get any more paydays after losing to that Janibek? That ain't going to happen. Janibek is a completely unknown fighter. Or I'm not going to say a completely unknown fighter, but a guy that, according to casual fans, he's not really relatively well known. And those Kazakhstan fighters, man, like for European fighters, when it comes down to it, and, let me also state this because, certain people have said, oh, well, don't call them European because they're mainly Asians and all sorts of stuff. Well, they kind of have a mix there. They're a little bit of a mix between Europeans and Asians, kind of like the Russians and some of those other places. But at one point in time, they were a part of the USSR. They're, in my view, at least I believe, a European country, even though, of course, they have a little bit more of an Oriental look, when it comes down to it. But those Kazakhstan boys, those Kazakh people, whether they be in MMA or boxing, whatever it is, those people can fight their ass off. Like I said, for the European countries, when it comes down to it, like the Kazakhstans, they're basically overall, like for Europe, like what the Argentines overall for that of the Latinos. Like the Argentines aren't usually as well known as the Puerto Ricans or the Mexicans or something like that. But when you get in the ring with them, like every time you fight against overall an Argentine fighter, whether it be Marcos Maidana, Sergio Martinez, Lucas Matisse, Brian Castano, get ready to go through hell because those guys are prepared. They're powerful. They have decent boxing ability and boxing IQ. They're very rough. They're very tough. Good luck against those guys. So once again, that would be a very, very stupid choice in my view for Andrade to take, at least right now. But we'll see where that goes. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. Or maybe it could be the better decision to possibly fight that Janibek And if you're able to beat him, then you could be remembered as one of the greater middleweight champions of your era. Then maybe go up and potentially fight Canelo or try to fight David Benavidez in a rematch. But we'll see. But in my view, if we were going to see either a fight between Andrade or Morrell, or Andrade versus that of Janabek, which fight do I think is more likely to happen? I think David Morrell is more likely to happen, but we'll see. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. We'll see where this goes. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.